You know, it's so funny when you get to the big twist of this film and you realize, oh, John Boorman really thought he was being clever, didn't he? I mean, kinda, I guess. Hey everyone, I'm Ben, your underground conductor, and welcome to Underground Cinema. It is good to be back. Now you might be asking yourself, where have I been? Didn't I just upload a video last week? Well, here's the thing. Yes, I did upload a video last week, but in terms of recording, this is the first time I've sat down to record in like 2.5 weeks. I've been pretty busy lately, and I had 1 or 2 videos pre-recorded, so I just spent the last few weeks editing them, and after editing them and posting them up, I just got so exhausted. November's been kind of a crunch month for me. As I mentioned previously, I was going to post up a different video at the beginning of the month to coincide with the election, but upon realizing that it was on November the 5th, I ended up crunching out a V for Vendetta review within 2 days from recording to final edit. The Clerks review that I did is probably the most in-depth review I've done so far, and took a lot out of me when I finished it, and then I had to rush out the Boondock Saints review that I recorded with my friend Anthony to coincide with the anniversary of that film. So suffice to say, November's been busy for me. That being said, I'm back now, and to wrap up November, and also tie in to Wicked, which just came out, I'm going to talk about Zardoz from 1974. You know, it's so funny, I keep this DVD right next to my copy of The Wiz, and I just keep them together. That way it says The Zardoz. The Zardoz. You get it? You get it? Am I smart? Am I clever? Huh? Am I clever? Am I as clever as John Boorman? Now, I mentioned this in the Pumpkinhead review I did with my friend Connor. Zardoz is a film that I first heard about in high school. When I was in high school, me and Connor ran a movie club where he was president and I was vice president, and the teaching advisor for our club had told us about Zardoz and told us that it was probably the weirdest film he had ever seen. And hearing about that film was one of many stones in the pathway that led me to create underground cinema. However, while I had originally heard about the film in high school, I actually didn't end up watching it until about 4 years ago. And I was so excited to have finally seen it that on my 22nd birthday, I decided to have all my friends watch it with me over Discord. That was a time. Suffice to say, Zardoz is an odd film. It's not the weirdest film I've ever seen. I think that award would go to the movie Rubber. But it's definitely an odd one. But you might be asking yourself, what is Zardoz about? Because you probably haven't seen it. Like, it says online that Zardoz is a cult classic, but I do not believe that, even a little bit. People have heard about this film, certainly, and people have seen images from it. Like, the most famous image of Zardoz is probably this picture of Sean Connery, you know, wearing a red Speedo, stripper boots, and a red bandolier. But in terms of people who've actually seen it, outside of my friends who I subjected Zardoz to, I'm convinced that the only people in the world who have seen this movie would be the people who were in it, this one guy on the street I stopped and talked to about the movie, the guy at the bookstore where I bought this DVD, myself, and Dan Harmon, creator of Community and co-creator of Rick and Morty. Like, in terms of underground films, this is about as obscure as they come. And even when you do watch it, it's pretty hard to wrap your head around just based on how the film is structured and executed. But when you break it down, the plot isn't too complicated. So the way the film opens up, you see the floating head of the title character Arthur Frayne, who is Zardoz. He gives a quick introduction to the film and sort of loosely explains what you should expect. After that introduction, we see the actual floating stone head of Zardoz floating down to greet his congregation, a bunch of brutal raiders known as the Exterminators. It also bears mentioning, and I learned this from the film's commentary, that the actual Zardoz head was modeled after John Boorman, the writer-director of this film. I mean, I can't see it, but he made the film and he said it, so I'll take his word for it. Anywho, Zardoz descends down to collect the wheat that his exterminators have gathered for him, and he espouses his central philosophy to his congregation, being that The gun is good. The penis is evil. This sort of edict that Arthur Frayne is passing down to his followers is sort of just to quell the population of these outlands. As we learn throughout the film, this takes place in sort of a post-apocalyptic era. The year is like 2293. And Arthur Frayne, as an individual, has been put in charge of governing over these lands. Put in charge by who, you might ask? Well, that's exactly what Sean Connery's character of Zed wants to find out. Also, side note, I am convinced that Zed's intro scene is meant to be a reference to the famous gun barrel sequence from James Bond, which is a pretty fun nod to Connery's past work. Anyway, the character of Zed stows away in the stone head as it's flying off, and as it's flying to its destination, he explores around a bit and tries to make sense of what he sees. However, as he's exploring around, he gets startled by Arthur Frayne, Zardoz, and ends up shooting him. Frayne falls out of the head's mouth, descends to the ground, and dies. For now. Zed then arrives to Zardoz's domain, which is this sort of country estate known as the Vortex. The Vortex is completely populated by functionally immortal human beings called Eternals. Upon arriving there, he explores the Vortex a bit, but then he gets caught by an Eternal named May. May looks through Zed's memories, concludes that Zed could have only come here through the head, and she's wondering what happened to Arthur Frayne. She then accesses Arthur Frayne's last transmitted memory and sees that he had fallen from the head. So from her perspective, there's a bit of a mystery going on regarding how this brutal raider got into their safe space, essentially, while the man who was in charge of this stone head descended to his death. I mean, if you ask me, it should be pretty obvious what happened if you put two and two together, but you can't assume, I guess. Anyway, May is curious to how a savage like Zed could have arrived here, so she wants to study him. However, another Eternal named Consuela wants Zed to be destroyed. They put it up to a vote with all the other Eternals in this community of Vortex 4. There are several vortexes, as it turns out. And the bulk of the Eternals feel like Zed would be a good presence around just to alleviate their boredom, since he is a different type of person and since he is mortal. This obviously makes Consuela upset, but unfortunately democracy is democracy. Side note, Consuela is actually played by an actress named Charlotte Rampling, who is spectacular in this film. She does an amazing job as the central villain of this film, and is also a very dexterous individual. I also learned this in the film commentary. Apparently she had done all the horse riding scenes herself. As it turns out, her father Godfrey Rampling was actually an Olympic medalist, so suffice to say she grew up in an athletic environment. It's also funny because her father, Godfrey, actually died about a month after his 100th birthday, which at the time made him the oldest living British athlete. Anywho, Zed is put under the charge of an Eternal named Friend. Real creative name, right? And Friend is sort of like a discontent and snarky individual. He's definitely like the black sheep of this otherwise peaceful community. As the film goes on, they study Zed's physiology more, and also force him to do several menial tasks, like a pack mule. They actually treat Zed like an animal so much that they even have him sleep in a cage. But it's interesting because as the Eternals are studying Zed, we as the audience get to learn more about the Eternal Society. Now, it's already a sound narrative choice to have our main character act as the audience POV, learning about the world as we are. But I also think it's a very clever inversion, the fact that the Eternals are trying to learn more about Zed, meanwhile Zed is learning more about them. I just find that to be ironic in the most interesting way. Anyway, as we come to know more about Eternal Society in this particular vortex, we also come to learn that the Eternals here have sort of broken up into three separate factions. There's the main Eternals that we interact with the most, and they've sort of crafted this idyllic but also sterile society for themselves. Sterile not only in the sense that everything is sort of clean and sanitized, but also sterile in the sense that all the men have limp dick. And it's interesting, because while this society is somewhat egalitarian, from each according to their ability to each according to their need, it's basically a commune. It also has a matriarchal element, which may explain the central emphasis on emotion, and specifically the concept of psychic violence, which is very much akin to like the concept of thought crime from 1984. The other two factions of Eternals that we come to learn about would be the Renegades and the Apathetics. Renegades are Eternals that have been punished with eternal old age. Most of the Eternals have eternal youth, and they are aged if they have committed some sort of psychic violation, but the Renegades have been overall outcasted from Central Eternal Society and have been punished with senility. Meanwhile, you have the apathetics, who are Eternals that have had their minds basically crack under the weight of eternal life. Because they cannot die, if they die, their bodies are just regrown, which is actually what's currently happening with Zardoz, Arthur Frayne. They lack excitement, and at a certain point they just become catatonic. It's actually quite interesting in this film, because when we first meet the apathetics, Zed's character tries to take one to bed her, but she's completely lifeless. Her eyes are open, but she's basically like a rag doll, and Zed gets angered by this. And it's so interesting in this scene because his anger and violence is actually enough to make some of the apathetics sort of snap out of this trance-like state that they're in and take notice, because something interesting is finally happening. As the film goes on, Friend's character gets punished and is forced to become a renegade. More studies are done on Zed's character, and the character of May discovers that Zed has been selectively bred to a point where he is basically a physically superior human being. Which is true visually if you just look at him. Putting aside the fact that Zed is played by Sean Connery, who was objectively a great specimen of manhood. The casting choices also show how genetically inferior the Eternals actually are when you look at them compared to Zed. Most of the actors and background extras that were cast to play Eternals in this film were very thin. They didn't look sickly or malnourished per se, but they looked physically weak. Meanwhile, you have Sean Connery come in with this broad frame and all this body hair, and he just looks like a stronger individual. And that's a very clever piece of visual world building, because you have a clear distinction between individuals who have lived pampered lifestyles where they don't really have to work that hard in an isolated, sort of idyllic utopian society, as opposed to someone who has had to raid and scavenge his entire life just to survive. Not only that, but it is also a good narrative hint for that reveal that he is genetically superior. That he is sort of the product of these eugenic experiments that Arthur Frayne, Zardoz, was performing in the Outlands. May obviously gets scared by her discovery that Zed is physically superior, but it also intrigues her. And later in the film, May presses Zed for answers, and we finally learn why Zed came to the Vortex. We have a flashback scene where we see Zed's tribe raiding this abandoned city. He gets drawn to the local library in the city, and when he goes in, he comes across a figure holding a book. The figure's unseen, but as soon as the figure leaves, the book remains there, floating in midair. Zed takes the book, and it's a basic alphabet book. From there, Zed is quickly able to read, because he is the superior man. And that's when Zed makes the discovery that his entire existence as he's come to know it is actually a lie. He reads through the various books in the library, and then he discovers one that sheds a light on the god that he's been serving. Zed makes the discovery that this giant floating head Zardoz is reminiscent of this book from one L. Frank Baum called The Wizard of Oz. And you have a little scene in the movie where Zed puts his fingers over, like, the letters in the book to spell Zardoz. And in that moment, you just realize, oh, yeah, Boorman really thought he was clever doing that. But Zed realizes, oh, this is a story about an old man who tricks people with a loud voice and a big mask. What if Zardoz is that? So Zed looks for answers, and he wants revenge for being manipulated. Once May understands all this information, she wants to bed Zed, because Sean Connery, and then Consuela shows up saying, no, that's mine. Actually, Consuela is disgusted by the whole affair and says, oh, this is bestiality, what you're doing, May. You're going to get aged 50 years for this. And then Consuela psychically attacks Zed. But Zed is stronger than Consuela, and this shocks her. And at this point, Consuela's like, yeah, no, this guy has to die. It's actually funny, and I also learned this from the commentary. This comes from John Boorman himself, so don't get mad at me. But according to Boorman, apparently, Charlotte Rampling in that psychic battle scene was looking forward to being by Sean Connery, and she was disappointed that the scene ended so quickly. I have no idea if that's true, that's just what John Boorman said in the commentary, so take it up with him. Anywho, Zed escapes from Consuela, but Consuela puts together a crew of people, and she's like, oh, we gotta hunt this guy down. Zed comes across the apathetics, and the apathetics start licking him because they're excited by him. Apparently that was supposed to be like a reference to like one of the stories of Isis, the Egyptian goddess, where she was like licking the sweat off of different gods. I couldn't find the story, I don't know. Anyway, Zed continues running, and he ends up with the renegades, who are also excited by him. So there's sort of like a full-scale revolution going on here. The different factions of the Vortex have basically started a civil war with each other. And this is what leads Zed back to the art gallery where he worked with Friend. May tracks Zed and Friend back to that gallery, saying, hey, we can fix the vortex for a next generation or whatever. And Zed and Friend are like, nah, we're not doing that. This place needs to go and we all need to die. And then May in that moment's all like, listen, I have supporters. Here's what we're going to do, Sean Connery. We're all going to get impregnated by you. I'm not joking. We're all going to get impregnated by you. You need to inseminate us, and we will share our information with you. So Zed basically has sex with I don't know how many women. And by the end of it all, he has become smarter than all of the Eternals. Now, if that ain't post-nut clarity, I don't know what is. Anyway, Consuela eventually gets into the gallery. She tries to kill Zed, but finds that she can't, because she's also excited by him. And she pledges her love to him, because of course she does. This is a 70s movie. And at this point, Zed is just trying to destroy the Tabernacle. And the Tabernacle is basically like this AI system that manages the entirety of the Vortex. It keeps the shield of the Vortex up, it maintains the immortality of all the Eternals, it rejuvenates them when their bodies die, and Zed is trying to take it down, but he can't figure out where it is. Until he does. Zed holds a crystal, and he realizes that since a crystal has like so many different reflective points and can refract light basically infinitely, that the AI of the Tabernacle must be hidden in the crystal. As it turns out, it is. Zed has sort of this final confrontation with the Tabernacle where he's like walking through like a house of mirrors. He then sees a reflection of his old self, the version of him that was a raider, and he shoots that version of himself, and that's what destroys the Tabernacle. May and her congregation of other women have left this society, so they get to live somewhere else and have Sean Connery's many, many bastard children. Arthur Frayne, Zardoz, has come to explain the purpose behind Zed's selective breeding. He's basically all like, it was me, Zed. I'm the one who selectively bred your forefathers together to form the perfect mutant to take down the Tabernacle. It was me, Zed. You know, we just have these separate plot points that are coming to a close as this narrative concludes and as shit hits the fan. Anyway, at this point, Zed has freed all of the Eternals from the curse of immortality, and they're all stoked that they can die now. But Zed doesn't have the stomach for killing anymore. He's changed as an individual. However, that doesn't stop the other raiders from coming in. Since the Tabernacle is gone, the shield that was around the Vortex is down, and they all ride in to kill the Eternals. As the exterminators are exterminating all the Eternals, Zed and Consuela actually escape to the now shattered head of Zardoz. They hide out in that cave. Zed and Consuela end up having a child together. That child grows and leaves. They grow old themselves, and then they pass away together. And the final shot of this film is just a handprint on the back wall as well as Zed's gun. And according to John Boorman, the handprint is meant to like symbolize sort of like this renewal for the human race, because like the idea of like a handprint is like one of the oldest images in human culture, which is true. It's also worth noting a couple other things. I do find this final scene interesting in terms of how it like sort of fast tracks the latter half of like someone's lifetime. Like the scene where Consuela is giving birth feels like it's almost juxtaposed with a scene of her having sex with Zed, because it begins with her sweating saying, "Oh, Zed," and then it immediately pivots to her pregnant. It's a very interesting juxtaposition. And then you just have the scene of them sitting in that one spot and it's sort of fast forwarding through their life as they're getting older and older. And another entertaining thing to note is that entire sequence where they are aging rapidly, obviously it's makeup, but apparently Sean Connery hated filming the scene because he just hated having like foreign things on his face. Completely normal and understandable. But what's funny is that they had to shoot that scene 3 times. Apparently what had happened is that the original film stock of that scene had a flaw in it, so they couldn't use it. They did a reshoot of it, and everyone was hungover because they'd already had the wrap party the night before, but they did the reshoot, and they set the scene exactly the same way, did the makeup again, took an entire day, and then they went in to edit that footage, but then they had discovered that an assistant cameraman who was hungover opened up the film stock, exposed it to light, and ruined it, so they had to reshoot it for a 3rd time. Sean Connery was so pissed that he almost killed that assistant cameraman. The assistant cameraman himself was so ashamed he had to leave the country. But yeah, that's the story of Zardoz. Now, I find this film incredibly entertaining. Like I said, this is sort of like a foundational film for me. And it has sort of all the hallmarks of like a film that I would enjoy. It's weird, it's existential, it's so relentlessly horny. However, there is a very important question that you need to ask at the end of the day. Is the film good? Well, as opposed to what everyone on the internet would tell you, I don't think that this film is that bad. I mean, it has substantial problems that I do want to get into in a bit, but I like this film, and I think there's a lot of essential elements of this film that work, and work really well. For one thing, I think the central performances are great. I already mentioned Charlotte Rampling, but Niall Buggy, who plays the title character of Arthur Frayne's Zardoz, he's amazing in this film. And it is so unfortunate that he's not in it more. John Boorman says this in the commentary, that Zardoz as a character is meant to be sort of like this trickster archetype, and that is definitely true. And it makes him so entertaining. Like, when he pops up on screen, he's just a joy to see. And the fact that he only shows up in, I think, like 3 or 4 scenes? It's a waste, really. I also love the fact that he has like a drawn-on curly hue mustache and like a goatee. It's like very reminiscent of like a classic magician, and I think that's just hilarious. Of course, the real standout in this film is Sean Connery. Funny thing, Connery actually was not the first choice to play the character of Zed. The first choice was actually Burt Reynolds, who had previously worked with director John Boorman on Deliverance. Unfortunately, Reynolds had to turn down the role because of illness. And when you understand that Burt Reynolds was the first choice, and you look at Sean Connery's general appearance for the film, a lot of things start to make sense. Like, oh, I can see it. I can see it. But I think Connery was ultimately a good choice for this film. Connery was fresh off of James Bond making this movie, and his talent really shows here. Like, anyone who follows film production history or listens to film trivia would probably know that Sean Connery was at times difficult to work with, but it's undeniable that the man was talented. And hearing about the few disagreements that him and John Boorman had in this film, I don't think it's evident of an egotistical actor. I think it's evident of a man who has standards, which I can respect. And I can also respect a man who is willing to forego those standards for the sake of creating great art. Like, I don't know, wearing a wedding dress in a scene. But moving to Connery's performance itself, it's so subtle and interesting, and seeing the way he plays off of other characters, particularly the Eternals, it really shows how he is taking advantage of this situation that he's in order to retain the upper hand. Throughout the entire film, you implicitly understand through Connery's performance that Zed is a character that knows more than he's letting on. Like, he's a guy that holds his cards close to his chest. And seeing how the Eternals sort of underestimate him and just think of him as some sort of brutal savage, it shows in so many different situations how he's surviving in an environment that is overtly dangerous to him. I also love the aesthetic in this film. I think this film is very well shot. I think the overall camera work and sort of the soft glow that you see in a lot of scenes give the film an ethereal quality and helps to emphasize the fantastical tone that this film embodies. It's just very talented camera work in this film, and it's worth noting that the cinematographer for Zardoz was Jeffrey Unsworth, the guy who did the cinematography for both 2001: A Space Odyssey and the original Superman from 1978. And you can definitely see that talent shine through here. It's also interesting when you watch a film like this and you also listen to the director's intention, how a director would communicate with a cinematographer. For instance, in the scene where Zed stows away on the Zardoz head, you have this amazing shot where Connery's hand is reaching up with his gun. And obviously I think it's well shot, but that particular scene was directed specifically like that because for some reason John Boorman is just obsessed with the image of a rising hand. And according to Boorman himself, he uses that specific shot of a hand rising in a lot of his films, including Excalibur with the Lady of the Lake. And I have seen that film, and yeah, it's the same. The shot's the same. So just the fact that he as a director was able to communicate his exact desire to a cinematographer to frame a shot like that, I think it speaks to the quality of filmmaking that's present here. I also enjoy the parallels that this film does have to The Wizard of Oz, because obviously it is an adaptation of The Wizard of Oz, loose as it may be. Obviously, as I alluded to earlier, the giant stone head is meant to be a reference to the wizard's head in the Emerald City, but there's also the parallels between May and Consuela, how May wants to protect Zed and study him, meanwhile Consuela just wants him to die. That's sort of a similar dynamic to Glinda the Good Witch and the Wicked Witch of the West. And there's also how Zed specifically arrives in the vortex. The way he arrives there in the giant floating head through all the fog is very much like how Dorothy arrives in Oz through her house getting sucked through a tornado. In fact, at the end of the film, when they destroy the tabernacle, you see the head of Zardoz crash to the ground very similarly to how Dorothy's house crashes into Oz. And another detail that I noticed, and I don't know if it was intentional, because it was very subtle, but when you're in the Outlands, at the beginning of the film, things are a bit muted, a lot of the area is gray, and I think visually that's probably meant to communicate the fact that this is sort of barren land, even though it's not, it's just Ireland, near where John Boorman lives. But when you actually get to the vortex, things are much more vibrant and colorful. Even the Eternals wear very colorful clothes. And I honestly don't know if that's meant to be a reference to The Wizard of Oz, because obviously the most notable adaptation of the material is the 1939 version, where it goes from like black and white sepia to color. Just a detail I noticed. Another side note, Zardoz came out like 35 years after The Wizard of Oz, and now it's been 85 years since The Wizard of Oz came out. Zardoz just turned 50, and now you've just had another Wizard of Oz adaptation come out being Wicked. Yeah, just the way the numbers are lining up, it's fun. Anyway, going back to the head though, another thing I want to bring up is that I think the special effects in this movie are spectacular. While I was rewatching the film, I really marveled at the way they did the floating head. Listening to the commentary, John Boorman confirmed that the floating head was a model, which I had already suspected, and that they had built it separately from like a larger head that they used as sort of set dressing for scenes where you see it on the ground, like when Sean Connery's climbing out of it when he gets into the vortex. Apparently, though, the way he was able to make the model head float was just by having it attached to the crane, and you don't see the crane or whatever rope or chain that they use to hold the head up because it's so foggy. Just a really clever way to hide things in camera. And you see that throughout the film, where you have effects that are being done in camera rather than in post, which you had to do for a lot of older films. But especially this one, since it was shot relatively on a low budget, it only cost $1 million. But it's amazing when they have an effect, and it's done in camera. Like the scene when Zed first holds one of the Eternal Rings, and it projects an image. And John Boorman explained how they did that effect in the commentary, but I still can't wrap my head around it, because it looks genuinely like the projection is coming from the ring rather than like a different projector. It's just amazing visually. Of course, everything I've just brought up are aesthetic elements of the film, referring to the homage that the film utilizes, or the mise-en-scène elements that the film employs. What this film is really about is the ideas, particularly the ideas regarding immortality. This idea of immortality is what really fascinated John Boorman the most when he was making this film, and that shows. I think the way John Boorman characterized the Eternals and conceptualized how a society of immortal beings would behave was incredibly fascinating. He did what any good storyteller should do. He took a concept and asked himself how real people would respond to this concept. The fact that the society had evolved past sex, for instance. Because sex is a tool for reproduction, why would you need to reproduce if your people never die? So as a result, all the men became impotent. The fact that so many Eternals crave death. The fact that so many of them get so bored that they fall into catatonic trances. But that's not all, though. It's also like the way the society itself was structured. Like I mentioned, the Eternals basically have a commune, and it's a very sterile community. And while it seems idyllic, and while they're essentially clean and safe, because they don't have anything to really worry about, they just spend all their time judging each other for literal thought crime, and punishing each other for it. And I think that's an incredibly clever way to show a dystopian society. Because in most of fiction, and there are countless examples to this, the two immediate ones that come to mind would be Metropolis in 1984. When you show a dystopian society in a theoretical future, typically you spend all your time highlighting the negative aspects of it. And generally speaking, those stories are meant to be a warning of how terrible society could become. And that's valuable, but it's also, like, obvious. Something that's interesting about a film like this is that the dystopia is not obvious. The dystopia has come as a consequence of a utopia that people have tried to form. And while things are technically stable, and there's no overt oppression, these people are creating problems for themselves. It reminds me a lot of the Sylvester Stallone movie Demolition Man, where in the future, society evolved so much past the point of violence that when a real criminal shows up, like Wesley Snipes, no one has any idea what to do. Because everyone at this point has become so soft that they're all pushovers. It also reminds me a lot of Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, where you have a society of people who have essentially become commodities. You know, the novel itself is a criticism of industrialization and obviously, like, the Ford auto model. But, you know, you have people who are, you know, addled by this drug soma, and there's free sex and free love everywhere. But people really don't have freedom. And speaking of Aldous Huxley, according to John Boorman, another thing that inspired the core concept of this film was After Many a Summer, another novel by Huxley. Now, I've never read After Many a Summer, I've only read Brave New World. But based on the way Boorman described that book and the impact it had on him, I think it might be something worth checking out, and I may do that in the future. But moving on from Huxley to other literature, something that I noticed in this film regarding the sort of utopian dystopia commentary that Boorman makes is how the concept of abundance in regards to immortality relates to like the concept of discontent that's explored by Fyodor Dostoevsky in Notes from the Underground. There's a very famous quote from Notes from the Underground where Dostoevsky essentially says that if you give a man everything he could possibly want, that if you make it the case that the only thing he has to worry about is eating cake and perpetuating his species, that if you drown him in an ocean of happiness so that only bubbles of bliss rise to the surface, that the first thing he'd do is just play a nasty trick, that he'd be so severely ungrateful that he would sacrifice everything. And that is a commentary on the innate dissatisfaction of human beings. It's a core aspect of the human condition, the fact that people crave challenge, that people crave conflict, and you see that in the everyday world. The better things get, the worse people feel, because when there's no real problems to deal with, you kind of have to create your own problems. Human beings innately don't want peace and tranquility. It's boring. And you see that in this film. The fact that all the Eternals want to die because there's nothing left to do. The fact that so many of them have become apathetic, which is honestly the most interesting aspect of the film to me. That many of them have fallen into catatonic trances because they're just bored. I think it is truly the best visual representation of how paradise can only lead to folly. Come to think of it, you actually see this exact same concept in The Good Place, when the main characters finally actually make it to the good place, to heaven, and they discover that everyone there has basically become like a jelly-brained idiot, that they're just so overwhelmed by all this positive stimuli that nothing interests them anymore. So the ideas that this film tackles are truly interesting. However, I do feel like you need to acknowledge the significant flaws with this film. While I do admire the ideas that this film plays around with, and I think that it explores them rather well, I feel like the film does prioritize the ideas over an actual narrative. Like I described the plot to you guys. But even knowing the plot going in and watching the film, it's still pretty hard to get narratively. It doesn't really feel like there's anything strong to latch on to for most of the film. And because of that narrative disconnect, when the film starts introducing all these big ideas and concepts, it's hard to remain invested and stay interested. And this was a problem when they were distributing the film. Like I mentioned at the beginning, the film begins with a floating head monologue from the character of Arthur Frame, from Zardoz. And that scene was added in post. John Boorman added that because apparently people were having a hard time understanding the film, and he thought if he included that at the beginning, that it would make it easier to understand the movie. It doesn't. Forecasting your film's events don't make the film easier to understand. If anything, it just makes the film even less engaging, because not only do you know what's coming up, but you still have to deal with the litany of ideas that you're being presented. Not only that, but it's also patronizing to the viewer. It's all like how at the end of Psycho, you have that doctor come out and he literally explains to the audience exactly what's going on with Norman. And it's like, okay, I get it. Maybe in 1960 people didn't know what DID was. But like, I feel like if you're watching the film, even at the time, you can understand, oh, this guy has like severe mommy issues and his mother's been dead for a long time, so he like internalized her personality in him. So he's basically talking to himself. Like, Psycho's still a great movie, but having that scene at the end just completely ruins the impact of the original twist. It makes the film worse. And the same thing goes for Zardoz. That scene up top with Arthur Frayne, while I like seeing him, and I like that character, it doesn't improve the film. It just adds to the confusion. And it's a misdiagnosis of the problem. The reason the film was difficult to understand wasn't because of all the plot elements. It was because of the way the plot felt like an afterthought to the ideas. That's also why so many plot points in the film don't make sense. Like how Consuela falls in love with Zed despite the fact that she spent the whole movie wanting to kill him. That ending completely ignores the basic concept of cause and effect, and the only reason it was put in is because John Boorman just loves the idea of love between a man and a woman. Never mind if it makes sense. This central issue that Zardoz has with over-presenting its ideas and themes, it's very similar to like the main problem with Blade Runner. Like, the reason why people love Blade Runner so much is because of like the rich themes of like what it means to be human, and that central question of what separates human from replicant. It's essentially the core focus of that film. However, with Blade Runner, the reason why people remember it and adore it and hold it up as like one of the pillars of science fiction is because it still had a narrative attached to it. It was essentially a neo-noir in the future. A future that is now the past because it takes place in 2019. But still, that's why people love Blade Runner, because it takes all these new, interesting, and fresh philosophical ideas and marries them to the narrative structure of a Central American genre, the detective story, the noir. Blade Runner is basically a throwback to that genre of the 1940s and 50s and movies like Double Indemnity or The Maltese Falcon. That being said, I do think that the problem that this film has with ideas and themes overtaking the narrative is evident of a larger issue regarding the director John Boorman. Now, I have only seen two of John Boorman's films, Zardoz and Excalibur from 1981. I haven't seen Deliverance, I've heard great things about it, I'll get to it at some point. But from what I've noticed of the selected films I have seen from him, is that he is a very esoteric filmmaker, which is not a bad thing. Like, I would say that George Lucas, prior to Star Wars, was a very esoteric filmmaker. Anyone who's seen THX 1138 would know that. Esoteric filmmakers are very interesting, especially in the experimental realm, and it's very clear that Boorman is the type of filmmaker who definitely wants the mood and tone to set into the narrative and do a lot of the heavy lifting. But with Zardoz, you can tell that the ideas and concepts that are played around with were just so interesting to Boorman that he structured the entire narrative around them. And then the story became an afterthought. Boorman himself admits this in the film's commentary, that this was an indulgent project for him. And when a filmmaker is overly indulging in all of their interests, typically the art suffers as a consequence. Now, it's true that this film, I feel like, is creative enough and makes enough clever decisions to narrowly pull itself out of this trap, but it's still an issue you have to contend with. And it's probably a good thing that this film had a limited budget. Like, you can tell when watching this film that Boorman's imagination was definitely bigger than the budget he had to make the movie. Hell, I think his imagination was also bigger than the technology that he had. Then again, he also admits that he has a distaste for computers and CGI in filmmaking. But if Boorman had been given more money, I don't think that this film would have become any better. I think the fact that he had limited resources to work with ultimately helped this film because it forced him to focus on creative problem solving with certain issues, like the fact that all the effects are in camera frame. Saves money in post. You know, the best art comes out of adversity. But still, Boorman's indulgence does show in this movie. I mean, there's literally a scene in the film where Arthur Frayne and Zed are just quoting T.S. Eliot at each other. And it's just because Boorman is a huge fan of Eliot, and Eliot is an amazing poet, don't get me wrong. But it's like, why did you do that? Why did you do that? The film is also kind of silly at times. Like, Boorman also acknowledged this. There's this one scene when all the Eternals are, like, psychically attacking the character of Friend, and they're just waving their arms. And, Boorman admits that that scene is laughable if you don't buy into the tone of the film. Of course, I would argue that's laughable even if you do. Although, speaking of the tone, I think another problem that this film has is related to sort of a confusion of the genre it belongs to. So, technically speaking, Zardoz is a science fiction film. I would say that the contemporary film that Zardoz has the most in common with would be Logan's Run, because it's a movie that deals a lot with this concept of mortality and isolation and utopia. But with Logan's Run, that film is firmly planted in the realm of science fiction. However, with Zardoz, so many of the aesthetic elements don't say science fiction. The film takes place in mostly naturalistic settings. There's a strong sense of mysticism to the film. The costume design and sets harken a lot to a past age, which is intentional. A lot of the props feel naturally derived, like the crystal rings or the big crystal that the tabernacle was in. All of these aesthetic elements scream fantasy. It makes the film feel like it's juxtaposed with the fantasy genre. And it makes it feel like Zardoz is a fantasy film that's merely masquerading as science fiction, which it essentially is. As mentioned, Zardoz is an adaptation of The Wizard of Oz rather loosely, but John Boorman initially got the idea for Zardoz while he was working on his adaptation of The Lord of the Rings. Boorman's Lord of the Rings film was never made. The script is out there on the internet. It's like 177, 178 pages. I heard it's terrible. I only read the first 10 pages. I thought it was okay. But the fact that he came up with this idea while he was working on what is essentially the quintessential fantasy narrative of modern Western culture, rivaling that of, like, King Arthur, I think illustrates the point that he was more interested in fantasy than science fiction. And the only element of this film that communicates any sense of science fiction, aside from some of the technology that you see, is mainly just the dialogue between characters, which is very technical. and I think helps ground the film in the sci-fi genre. But still, now if Boorman wanted to blend genres in this film, the same way George Lucas did with Star Wars blending sci-fi and fantasy, I feel like he could have done that pretty easily with Zardoz. It would have been relatively simple to do too. I feel like the best way you could have blended the genres in this film is if you had just spent more time in the Outlands with the Raiders. Spending more time out in the frankly beautiful Irish countryside wouldn't just be aesthetically pleasing, but it would also help build the world a bit more, expand the scope, that way it doesn't feel just limited to this sort of country estate where the Eternals live. And spending time in that naturalistic setting with a bunch of religious zealots that are doing the dirty work of this false deity, it would help to firmly ground the tone in fantasy before establishing an actual twist where one of them, Zed, takes a peek behind the curtain and finds out that there is a small group of scientific elites that have just been manipulating him and his clan the whole time. I feel like doing that would have definitely improved this film significantly, and helped to have blended these disparate genres to avoid tonal inconsistency. But unfortunately, as it stands, there is a clash between sci-fi and fantasy that is unresolved in this film. Anyway, another thing I want to mention, and this sort of goes back to the idea focus issue I've referenced with the film. Like I said, it is very similar to Logan's Run, and Logan's Run has esoteric elements. But with Logan's Run, there's still a strong enough narrative behind the concept and enough mainstream appeal that helps define it as both an entertaining and an artistically valuable film. I truly think that's what Zardoz is missing. That all being said though, while I do think Zardoz has significant issues, I do think that this film is worth seeing. Like I said, I think a lot of the ideas are tackled really well. I think while the narrative is lacking, a lot of the other elements of the film work. Like the performances, the world building, the execution of ideas. And while I was critical of Boorman in this video, I do think that he is a talented filmmaker. And I think he's an admirable artist. For better or worse, you can feel the passion that comes out of Zardoz. You understand that this was a personal project, that this was an auteur project, that this was a story that an artist wanted to tell. And I respect that. And I also respect all the effort that Boorman made to make this film. All the issues that he faced, like almost not being able to import in gun props for the film, not being able to afford enough costumes, so some of the extras had to wear red paint. The fact that in his cameo in this film, where he gets shot by Sean Connery, he actually got shrapnel stuck in his head. All of that shows passion and resilience in the face of adversity. And that's what filmmaking is all about. It's all about problem solving. And John Boorman, if you somehow stumble across this, I sincerely doubt it, I just want to congratulate you on your career. Because for better or worse, and like I said, I've only seen 2 of your films, I promise I'll watch Deliverance. You are a creative filmmaker, and I respect that you made unique movies, because not enough people do that. But yeah, that was my review of Zardoz. I hope you all enjoyed it. Please feel free to subscribe if you're feeling generous. You can also follow me on Instagram or Letterboxd if you want to hear more of my film takes, and I will see you later. The gun is good. The penis is evil. Hey! So, Zardoz patch. This is the second item for the cumulative raffle I'm doing. In case you missed my Clerks review, I am doing a raffle for when I finally reach my first 500 subscribers. And what I'm essentially going to do is accumulate different pieces of merchandise and assemble them into a big pot to give away for when I reach my first 500 subscribers. I will not be including a new piece of merchandise with every single video, but if I have something that is vaguely related to whatever film I'm talking about, I will include it. So if you would like to match with me, all you have to do is subscribe to my channel and comment on this video. And you'll be entered in. I will select a winner when I reach my first 500. So that's 2 items currently. There will be more to come.